On the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark. She saw the stone had been removed from the tomb. On this Easter sunrise morning, I thought it would be fitting for us to go back to the tomb and to think about what was going on that early morning. Mary Magdalene, if you don't know or have forgotten, was the most famous female follower of Jesus. And like many others who followed Jesus for a long time, she had extraordinary faith in him. She had extraordinary confidence in him. She believed him to be a great teacher. She believed him to be from God. She had seen him perform miracles. She had been a recipient of miracles that Jesus performed. She was impressed with his compassion. She believed that he was maybe the most extraordinary communicator she'd ever heard. I mean, it's remarkable how much faith and confidence and respect she had for Jesus. And yet, even Mary Magdalene, on Easter morning, went to the tomb and she believed that Jesus was dead and he would stay dead. Maybe you know the story. And if you were with us last week, we reminded you of it. But Jesus had been arrested, tried, and crucified. Traditionally, a body would be left on the cross for days, and it would take that long for them to fully expire. But in Jesus' case, because of the beating that he had endured before, he had bled to death. And so Nicodemus and a man named Joseph of Arimathea decide that they will step up and do their part. They're not really sure what to do with Jesus. They don't really know who he is, but they know that he's special, and they know that he deserves better than to hang on a cross. And so they go to Pilate, and because of Joseph's clout and position, perhaps he's able to convince Pilate to let them take Jesus' body off the cross, which was typically not allowed. But Pilate agrees, and so Joseph and Nicodemus, presumably some servants, went and took Jesus' body from the cross, and they prepared him for burial, and they took him and placed him in a tomb that had not been used. It was a tomb for Joseph's family, and as sad as they were, they just put the stone in front of the tomb and went home. Typically, at this point, the body would lay in the tomb until everything had decomposed but the bones, and then those bones would be placed in what was called an ossuary, or a bone box, and then that box would be slid into a recess of the tomb. This is what was expected to happen. Mary Magdalene expected this to happen, and so she's going to the tomb just before sunrise because the Sabbath will end, and then she'll have the opportunity to actually do better maybe than what Joseph and Nicodemus had done. It seems that she just didn't feel like enough had been done, or that perhaps more could be done or should be done. And she's preparing to go into the tomb. Think about this for a second. She's preparing to go into the tomb with a dead body that had been there for days now, and is going to re-embalm the body. She knew that Joseph and Nicodemus had already done this, but she gathered some of her friends, and they wanted it to be done right. It also says something about how much she loved and respected Jesus. I asked Lindsay once. I said, if you didn't think that the embalmers did a good job on me, would you redo what they did? And she said, no, I think I'd just go with whatever they did. But this is the level of respect and the level of concern that Mary Magdalene has for Jesus. But in spite of that, when she goes to the tomb on that early Easter morning, she believed Jesus was dead, and she assumed he would stay dead. And when she approaches the tomb and she sees that he's not there, she's shocked. This is not at all what she expected. But she still didn't assume a resurrection. Verse 2 tells us that so she ran to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and this is kind of John's signature. He's writing this. He is the other disciple. And it's important to notice they're not waiting at the tomb. They're not there. They're not expecting a resurrection either. They're hiding out. In fact, they're thinking, if the chief priests in Rome are in collusion with one another, we're in trouble, right? So they're trying to figure out what to do next and where to go and how they're going to, even survive. And they're certainly not hanging out near the tomb. So when Mary Magdalene comes to Jesus' followers, keep in mind, all of them are in hiding. When she comes to tell them what's going on or what she's discovered, none of them, all of them are in hiding. None of them are waiting at the tomb. These are men and women who had been with Jesus. They had eaten with Jesus. They were touched by Jesus. They heard all of his teachings. They experienced his miracles, and yet not a single one of them was standing outside the tomb waiting for a resurrection. Because maybe some of them are like you. Maybe like you, they believe Jesus is a great teacher, that he may be prophet, that he's sent from God, that he did miracles, that he was wise and a great communicator, but they believed he was dead and that he would stay dead. The text goes on and says, and said to them, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. So she's assuming that someone has taken Jesus' body. Now, why was she assuming that? Well, because there was no body in the tomb. And bodies don't just get up and walk out, right? So she assumed that if a body is missing, it's because someone must have taken it. Now, Luke gives us a little bit more detail. He tells us in verse 10 that it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them were telling the apostles these things. So Luke tells us there were actually more involved than just Mary Magdalene. And all of them rush in and they're sharing this news that someone has taken the body. But verse 11 says, but these words seemed like nonsense to them, and they did not believe the women. Maybe a good point to just point this out to you right now. In the first century, a woman's word was not even considered admissible in court. They were considered too emotional and that they couldn't be relied upon in terms of testimony. So the fact that the gospel writers include the fact that women were the ones that brought the news is remarkable in and of itself. If you were making up a story in the first century, you certainly wouldn't have women being the first witnesses. And yet the simplest explanation is the best one, that this is just what happened. These women came and reported this, and then when they get the word, they're thinking, "What do you mean? There's no body? That's nonsense. The body has to be there." And again, they weren't expecting a resurrection. And maybe you are someone today who would say that you believe a resurrection is nonsense. Well, the good news for you is that many of the men and women who knew Jesus best, men and women who Jesus looked into their eyes and called them to follow him, men and women who sat with Jesus, who walked with Jesus, they thought a resurrection was nonsense too. Verse 12 says, Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. When he stooped to look in, he saw only the linen cloths. So he went home amazed at what had happened. Even seeing the empty tomb, I'm not convinced that Peter, even at this point, is assuming a resurrection. They believed, again, what many of you believe, that he was a great teacher. He taught us about the Good Samaritan. He gave us the Sermon on the Mount. But a resurrection? Peter was skeptical. All of them were skeptical. But if that's where you are today, I want you to wrestle with this. Again, if you were going to make up a story that you just wanted everybody to believe, I mean, you wouldn't write a story like this one. Because throughout this all four Gospels, the Gospel writers document their own disbelief. They document the fact that they lost faith, that they walked away, that they were cowards, that they hid. They document the fact that when Jesus was arrested, they all went into hiding. Peter documents the fact that before, just outside Pilate's court, he denied even knowing Christ 3 times. And that's not the story you tell if you just want to make up a story for everyone to believe. The story you tell is that even though everybody else lost faith, I stayed faithful. That's the story you tell if you want everyone to believe. That's the story you make up, not the one that we were just reading. You don't make up a story where you're a coward that's hiding out and scared and confused. And the thing that I want you to kind of wrestle with is do you know why the Bible portrays Jesus' closest followers as being puzzled and confused? It's because they were puzzled and confused. This is not what anybody was expecting. This is this is not what anybody was camped out for. Nobody was doing a countdown outside the tomb waiting for Jesus to come out. This seemed like nonsense. This seemed too incredible to be true. And yet, just a few weeks later, not years later, not decades later, just a few weeks later. These same men who went into hiding, Peter, for example, just a few weeks later would look into the eyes of the men who sentenced Jesus to death. And he would say to them, "You killed him, but God raised him." And everything changed. After this point, Peter goes back and he's confused. He's trying to figure all this out. And eventually he sees the resurrected Jesus and everything changes. I just want you to know on this Easter morning that Easter is not just a celebration of Jesus' teachings. Easter is not just a celebration of who Jesus was. Easter is a celebration of who Jesus is because of the resurrection. The story that these men would go on to tell is not that Jesus lived and we're going to keep his memory alive. The story they told was Jesus lives. You killed him. Again, looking into the eyes of the men who have the power to now put Peter to death. He looks into their eyes, these men that put Jesus to death, and he says to them, "You killed him, but God raised him." The story is not he lived and we want to keep his memory alive. The story is he lives. In spite of what you've done to him, he lives. And that's what the story is. That's what the point of this message is this morning, is that Easter is the celebration of a very specific event where Christ conquered death in the grave, and ultimately for your benefit and mine. Later on today, we'll talk more about that. But thank you for joining us for the sunrise service. Please make use of all the other elements of the website and get as much Easter out of it as you can.